Monday, September 2nd, 1991, three spelunkers entered Clarksville Cave in Albany County, New York. They were Gary Lau, Mark McNiff, and 30-year-old Beverly Schwartz. Lau and McNiff had many years of caving experience, while Schwartz had about 2 years of experience and had attended an NCRC workshop earlier that summer. This was not a random beginner trip into an unfamiliar cave. The group had a purpose. On an earlier visit, a dig site with airflow had been found near the Twinkle Room in the ward section of the cave, and on this trip, they intended to return to that spot and continue working it. The route took them into a part of the cave where the space became increasingly restrictive. The dig was located at the end of a passage extending north from the Twinkle Room for about 30 feet. For most of that distance, the passage was only around 3 feet wide and 18 inches high, too narrow for 2 people to pass each other. That meant whoever was inside had to work alone, while the others waited behind. Near the end, the crawlway became even more awkward. It made a 90-degree bend to the right, then sloped downward at about 20 degrees for the final 10 feet. That last section was too tight to allow a person to turn around. Anyone entering it had to understand that backing out might be the only realistic way to leave. The cave was also damp and cold, around 45 degrees Fahrenheit, so the group took turns digging to keep each person from becoming chilled. There was a slight breeze in the dig passage, which was one reason the site had caught their attention. Airflow in a cave can suggest that a passage continues somewhere beyond the obstruction. And for explorers, that possibility can make an uncomfortable crawl worth investigating. Schwartz went third. She entered the low dig passage and worked at the site for a while, squeezed into a space where her body had very little margin around it. In a passage 18 inches high, a person's size becomes more than a general physical detail. It determines how easily the hips pass through, how much the chest can expand, whether the shoulders can angle through the bend, and whether a person has enough room to pull their knees under them or shift from one side to the other. Schwartz was overweight and out of shape, and inside a crawlway this low, that became a serious disadvantage. The extra body size did not need to be extreme to matter. It only had to be enough to reduce the little clearance the cave still allowed. At around 4 p.m., Schwartz reached the end of her shift and tried to back out. That was when the trip turned into an emergency. She could not get her hips past a tight place in the passage. The problem was not that she was deep in the cave, or that the route was complicated. The problem was that the shape of the passage and the shape of her body no longer matched in reverse. She had managed to get into the dig passage, but getting back out required her hips to pass through the constriction from a different angle, while she was tired, cold, and moving backward through a tunnel too low to let her reset her position. Her companions tried to help. For the next hour and a half, Schwartz made numerous attempts to back out. They looked for anything that might be increasing the problem. One possibility was that her clothing was binding up in the tight space, catching against the cave, or adding bulk around the hips and legs. A companion was able to help her remove her boots, nylon coveralls, and polar fleece thermal bottoms. Schwartz also removed her polar fleece top, leaving herself in a layer of polypropylene. This was a common kind of desperate solution in a tight cave squeeze. When a constriction is only slightly too tight, removing layers can sometimes create just enough clearance for the body to slide through. But in this case, it did not work. Even with the outer layers removed, Schwartz still could not back out. The weight and shape of her body remained trapped at the hips, and now another danger had been introduced. She was in a 45-degree damp cave, and the clothing that helped keep her warm had been removed in the hope of making her smaller. The attempt made sense in the moment because the constriction seemed to be the immediate problem, but it also left her more exposed to cold at the worst possible time. She was still stuck, still unable to move normally, and now less protected from hypothermia. After failing to back through the constriction, Schwartz tried a different approach. She moved forward slightly and attempted to turn around, thinking it might be easier to pass through the tight spot head first. She tried to contort herself within the narrow space, looking for an angle that might give her hips or shoulders a better path, but that too failed. At about 5:50 p.m., as Schwartz struggled to turn around, her right foot became wedged in a vertical crack between two rocks. The situation immediately became more complicated. Before that moment, the main problem had been that her hips would not pass the constriction. Now, one of her feet was locked in the rock as well. She was lying on her left side, with her back against the left wall, and her right shoulder only about an inch from the ceiling. Her right leg was fully extended between her torso and the right wall, while her left leg was extended normally. This was an extremely poor position to escape from because her body was pinned by the passage, her hips could not clear the tight place, and her foot was now wedged separately in the crack. Lau and McNiff discussed the situation and decided they needed outside help. McNiff stayed with Schwartz while Lau exited the cave. McNiff wrapped a garbage bag around her and hugged her leg to provide warmth, because by then, cold was becoming a major threat. Lau moved quickly and took only about 12 minutes to exit the cave. At a convenience store, he tried to call the rescue number he had written inside his helmet, but the phone would not accept his credit card. The clerk suggested a local spelunker, and from there, the rescue alert went out. Loeb got hot coffee and candy bars, then returned to the incident site. By the time he got back to Schwartz, her condition had worsened. She was shivering hard and was unable to move or speak. Her head was out of reach, so Lau placed the jug of hot coffee against her abdomen and took a shift at hugging her to provide warmth. As rescuers began arriving, McNiff went to the entrance and requested a tube so hot drinks could be administered to her. He also checked the possibility of using a very small entrance only 50 feet from the Twinkle Room, both for access and as a route for wires from a generator that could provide heat. An EMT entered with a scissors jack, space blankets, and a hot drink. The scissors jack was used to free her foot from the crack, but that did not fully solve the entrapment. Even after the foot problem was addressed, the original constriction still held her body. Rescuers tried to enlarge the tight place with a pneumatic hammer, but the effort was ineffective. The passage allowed only one person to work at the victim at a time, and at the same time, others had to focus on keeping her condition from getting worse. Phone lines and a doctor arrived, and power lines were run into the cave. Rescuers were able to give Schwartz some glucose solution, and they applied heat using a heat lamp and a hairdryer. The hairdryer quickly stopped working, but the heater was placed near her back with a space blanket positioned to reflect warmth toward her. Once her condition stabilized, the rescuers could focus more directly on freeing her. The solution was not to force her body through the constriction by pulling harder. That could have injured her or made the problem worse. Instead, they excavated gravel and mud from beneath her, creating the space the cave had denied her. By removing material below her body, they gave her hips and leg enough room to shift. Finally, there was enough clearance to pull Schwartz back far enough to get her leg out. With help, she was able to crawl to the Twinkle Room. Then she was assisted to the Lake Room. From there, she was secured in a sked stretcher and carried out of the cave. She reached the entrance at 3:40 a.m. on Tuesday, after being trapped for about 8 hours. Her core temperature was reported at 95 degrees Fahrenheit, confirming how close the cold had come to becoming fatal. On Saturday, January 15, 1972, 18-year-old Roger Young went into Armpit Cave in Pennsylvania with 2 other young men, William and Richard. It was winter, the kind of January day where the cold outside was already dangerous before anyone even entered the ground. But at first, this was just supposed to be a small caving trip. Armpit Cave was not a massive underground system with huge chambers or long walking passages. It was a tight cave, low and narrow in places. The type of cave where a person had to crawl, twist, flatten himself, and carefully choose how to move through each constricted section. For someone with a lot of experience, that kind of cave was uncomfortable but manageable. For someone still new to caving, every tight section carried the risk of choosing the wrong body angle and realizing too late that there was not enough room to correct it. Young had been in this cave before, but only once. This was just his second caving trip, and his first trip had also been to Armpit Cave, so he knew the cave just enough to recognize parts of it, but not enough to fully understand how unforgiving it could be. The 3 men entered and began exploring the tight passages, moving through the crawlways as the cave forced them lower and lower. In a place like Armpit Cave, progress was not made by walking. It was made by pushing forward on elbows, sliding across rock, lifting one shoulder at a time, and trusting that the body could pass through whatever opening came next. For the first 45 minutes to an hour, the trip continued without becoming an emergency. They were inside a cramped cave, but they were still moving, still exploring, and still close enough to the entrances that nothing about the situation must have seemed impossible. Then, after that first stretch of exploration, they were back near one of the cave's entrances. Young was within about 10 feet of the way out, close enough that under normal circumstances, the trip should have been almost over. That is what makes the incident so unsettling. He was not deep underground. He was not lost in a far chamber. He was not trapped hundreds of feet beyond a complicated route. He was almost at the entrance, in the final part of the cave, where escape should have been simplest. But in tight caves, the last few feet can become just as dangerous as the deepest section if the passage narrows around the wrong part of the body. As Young crawled through that tight section, his position became awkward. He was lying on his stomach, with his body pressed into the crawlway and his back arched inside the low passage. His feet were about 2 feet higher than his head, meaning he was not stretched flat on level ground. His lower body was raised while his head and upper body were lower, forcing him into a strained downward angle. In that position, his weight pressed into the cave differently. He could not simply stand, roll over, or reset himself. He had to move exactly within the shape the cave allowed. Then his left leg slipped into a crack and became wedged. That was the moment the crawl turned into an entrapment. Young was overweight, and in a cave this tight, that became a serious problem. His size did not matter in the open air outside, and it may not have mattered much in a larger passage, but inside Armpit Cave, the extra body mass reduced the space he had to work with. The passage was already narrow, and once his body filled it, there was very little room left to shift his hips, bend his knee differently, or pull the trapped leg back out. His back was arched, his feet were higher than his head, and his left leg was locked in a crack, so every normal escape movement was blocked by some other part of the cave. If he pulled backward, the leg held him. If he tried to push forward, the tight passage and his body angle stopped him. If he tried to change position, there was not enough room to turn. William and Richard tried to free him themselves. At first, that would have seemed like the obvious thing to do. Young was close to the entrance, and his companions were right there with him, so the first response was to pull, adjust, and try to work him loose from the crack. They used several methods, including getting a rope around his waist and pulling, but the cave did not give them the kind of space rescuers normally need. Young's body was wedged in an awkward line, and pulling from the wrong angle could not simply slide him out. The more they tried, the more obvious it became that he was not just briefly stuck. His leg had locked him into the passage, and his body position made it impossible for him to free himself by strength alone. For about an hour, they kept trying without success. Every attempt had to happen from a cramped position, inside the same tight cave that had trapped him in the first place. When they realized they needed help, they contacted the Pennsylvania State University Campus Patrol. Nittany Grotto had printed rescue cards listing the 24-hour phone number for the campus patrol, and one of Young's companions had that card with him. The patrol then contacted the Nittany Grotto for cave rescue assistance. Shortly after the call for help, 4 members of the Nittany Grotto arrived at Armpit Cave by chance. They had not come because of the rescue call at first. They had come to map the cave. But once they arrived, they immediately became part of the rescue effort. They had the experience that Young and his companions did not have, and they understood what a tight cave entrapment required. Even then, Young could not be moved easily. His body was still locked in the same difficult position. Stomach down, back arched, feet higher than his head, left leg wedged in the crack. The cave allowed only limited access to him, and the rescuers still had to figure out how to change his position without driving him deeper into the constriction or worsening the trapped leg. More members of the Nittany Grotto arrived later, responding to the request for help, and by about 4:40 in the afternoon, additional experienced spelunkers were at the scene. Outside, the temperature was around 6 degrees Fahrenheit, or about minus 15 degrees Celsius, and it was still falling. Inside, Young began complaining about the cold and about the exhausting position he was stuck in. He had not panicked, which helped everyone, but staying calm did not make the physical problem disappear. A blanket and hot coffee were sent into him, but even that was difficult because the cave was so tight that only about 3 people could squeeze inside at one time to assist him. The rescue had to be done carefully. Pulling on him from outside had not worked because the problem was not only that he needed force. The problem was that his overweight body was caught in the wrong geometry. His leg had to be freed from the crack, and his body had to be moved in a way so that he could be freed from the restriction. Finally, the rescuers used a combination of pushing from below, while others pulled on ropes connected to his waist and belt. That combined movement gave them what the earlier attempts lacked. They were not just dragging him against the cave, they were trying to lift and shift him out of the exact position that had locked him there. Slowly, the pressure began to change. With rescuers pushing from below and others pulling from the ropes, Young was worked out of the tight section. It was not a dramatic instant escape, but a slow physical extraction from a passage that had held him for nearly 4 hours. By 5:40 in the evening, he was finally out of Armpit Cave. He had been stuck since about 1:45 p.m., and although he was not injured, he was weak and shaky from the cold and from the strain of being trapped in that position for so long. The frightening part of Roger Young's story is that nothing about the trip needed a long distance to become dangerous. The entire incident happened close to an entrance after less than an hour of exploring in a cave he had already visited once before. But Armpit Cave was tight, Young was inexperienced, and when his overweight body became locked in an awkward belly-down position, with his back arched and his feet above his head, the cave left him almost no room to correct the mistake. His left leg wedged in a crack, and from that point on, the entrance being only 10 feet away did not matter. For 4 hours, the cave held him in place until experienced rescuers finally shifted him free,